Good morning, everyone. Good to see you here today. It's not quite frosty out there, but probably just another 100 feet up the mountain somewhere, you'll probably find frost, but it's interesting. Well, let's begin. C.S. Lewis was born a genius, without question. He was also sensitive and very, very imaginative. He was born in a house full of all kinds of books, which he voraciously read. He says, "My parents didn't withhold anything from me." His father was a successful solicitor, a very emotional man that Lewis found hard to get along with. He adored his mother, who was quite accomplished and contributed to his education. And he very much enjoyed his brother Warren, or Warnie as he was called, with whom they shared interests and fun, including the creation of their own make-believe world called Animal Land, which was complete with talking animals and very grown-up politics. Lewis says it's quite boring. He tells us in Surprised by Joy. Oh, and by the way, the notes are online at my blog if you want to look that back up again, revbeckmann.com with 2 N's for Beckmann. Second lecture. Now, Lewis tells us in Surprised by Joy that in his younger years, he lived almost entirely in his imagination. He had a lot of time on his hands. He says in the chapter called The First Years, quote, "But imagination is a vague word, and I must make some distinctions." And he goes on to describe ways of imagining. He says the word may mean the world of reverie, daydream, wish-fulfilling fantasy. Of that I knew more than enough, imagining things that he would do. And this is what I was talking about last night. But I must insist that this was a totally different activity from the invention of Animal Land. Animal Land was not, in one sense, fantasy at all. I was not one of the characters it contained. See, he was the character in his daydreaming. He's dreaming about what he was going to do. But instead, I was its creator. And some fail to recognize the difference. In my daydreams, I was training myself to be a fool. In mapping and chronicling Animal Land, I was training myself to be a novelist. In other words, mere daydreaming was an exercise in vanity, but creating was useful. But Lewis admits that there was no wonder, no awe in Animal Land, not like there was going to be in Narnia. Narnia contained invention that was on a third and higher plane, which hopefully contained hints of a transporting wonder, which experiences of wonder he goes on in his autobiography to famously describe as joy, which he defines what depends. I was going to give you a page number, but there's so many different editions, so I'm trying not to do that. Now, speaking of this joy, he does write this. "It is an unsatisfied desire which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. It might almost equally well be called a particular kind of unhappiness or a grief." And he's talking about the kind of experience, transcendent experience that might come over you seeing something beautiful or hearing some music that's beautiful, or like my friend that I spoke of last night that was at Yellowstone, and he just walks away just like, this is amazing. But this joy, this desire, it's tugging at your heart. You're wanting more of it, but you realize you're really wanting more of something else at the same time. And then you try to get it again, and you can't. So you're missing it. So it's that kind of thing going on. Sadly, to all of Lewis's brilliance and his imaginative nature and his rich emotions was added in his youth the devastating grief of the loss of his mother. He was still just 9 years old. So a new element began to grow in his soul, a resentment toward God. He had prayed that his mother would not die, but she did anyway. And as he grew into his teens, it was no surprise that he acquired an atheistic position. Usually atheists have got some grudge against God. By the time of the end of World War I, taking studies back up in Oxford in 1919, Lewis called himself a realist, and he labeled his alteration the new look, my new look. I'm a realist. He was someone who believed that only matter and nature are real. He would have no spiritual existence or being. All the world was just matter following observable laws. Quote, we, speaking of himself and fellow realists, accepted as rock bottom reality the universe revealed by the senses, unquote. He did, however, have a chink in his armor, and that was his experience of beauty and desire or joy. He did not want to let it go. He could not give it a metaphysical quality, but he would not dismiss its existence. He just said, it's valuable. The problem is that if everything is ultimately matter, as we said last night, then everything has no more value than anything else, and no more value than matter itself possesses, which is no value to you at all when it comes to such things as truth and goodness and beauty. But then, being in Oxford, Lewis began to make friends, and for some odd reason, all of them, for the most part, being Christians. One of them was Owen Barfield. Now, Barfield is considered the first and the last inkling. The inklings were Lewis's conversation, get-together once-a-week buddies. What a way to put it, but anyway, there it is. He earned Barfield, I'm going to introduce you to Barfield. Barfield earned 2 English degrees from Oxford, and he was a prolific poet and author all of his life. In 1934, which means that he had been in Oxford for some time at this point, he had to leave Oxford to practice law in London, but he and Lewis kept close touch all of Lewis's life. Barfield did not die until 1997. Lewis died in 1963. In his early years at Oxford, after Lewis and Barfield had become friends, Barfield became a Christian anthroposophist. There you go. We'll see how many times I can say that. Anthroposophy was a philosophy following the teaching of a German named Rudolf Steiner, which held that all of our existence is in some way spiritual. Instead of the rock bottom of reality being matter, for Steiner, it is instead more like a spirit or a mind, capital M. And our minds are in some way related to that primary mind, and thus we are able to know the existence or the reality of things, and perhaps even help to form them. The reason that we in this world exist is because this mind or this spirit has projected all of this into the world as it appears to us, much like a playwright creates characters of his play and the setting for them all. When we imagine anything, therefore, in our minds, it is ultimately that spirit which is imagining through us. And so we experience a kind of communion or a participation with that spirit. Sounds kind of like Eastern mysticism in a way, doesn't it? Now, Barfield began to confront Lewis about his materialistic realism, and so began what they affectionately called the Great War between them from 1926 to 1930. And this congenial friend-building debate, which appeared both in face-to-face conversation and in letters or theses that they passed to one another, it all resulted in Lewis leaving behind his realism and assenting to idealism. Barfield got to it, okay? And this idea that a spirit was behind the existence of the universe. But Lewis did not go as far as to accept Barfield's anthroposophy. He could not go along with everything Steiner taught because some of it was simply too irrational, too pantheistic. It didn't fit Lewis's cast of mind. Lewis maintained what may be called a strong element of practical common sense. It comes out in his writings, you know, how sometimes there's the way he can talk about things. It's just so down to earth. And just, oh yeah, I know what that's like. However, this idealism that he has now, he was a realist, he's replacing that materialistic realism with an idealism. This idealism certainly served his desire to hang on to the imaginative. Because now, instead of the activity of imagination being like a post-it note stuck on the book of his realism, it's valuable. It doesn't fit in, but we'll leave it there. It now, however, the imaginative now is part of a continuous theme based on the belief that when we reason or when we imagine, we are experiencing or participating in or sharing in the reasoning and the imagination of that spirit that has brought us into existence. And so Lewis's understanding of imagination was now more based on his understanding of ontology, the nature of being in the universe, instead of something psychological or anthropological. Now, you may wonder how a Christian like Barfield could believe this idea of the nature of the universe, that everything is this spirit. It doesn't sound very much like the kind of thing that we read about in Genesis. It sounds more like some kind of Eastern pantheistic idea, and anthroposophy did have its Eastern influence. But remember, we are plainly told in Scripture that God is a spirit, right? Next, recall the scriptural image of the wisdom of God, such as we have in Proverbs 8, and certainly the Logos of John 1, coupled together with verses elsewhere in the Bible about everything that exists being dependent on the presence of Christ, like Paul's quotation from last night, and Paul's quotation of that Greek poet in the book of Acts, who said that we live and we move and that we have our being in God. If we combine the idea that the bedrock of our being, our existence, is Christ, and we are remade in his image, and that we can share his divine nature, as Peter says in 2 Peter 1:4, then you can start to see how this idealistic thinking of Barfield's can overlap with Christian faith. I'm not saying it is all Christian. I'm just saying you can see how a Christian can kind of move in that direction. The Christian God is an immanent God, present and engaged in all creation, as Jesus represents him in Matthew 10, so poetically. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing, and one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father? But then the much more argument. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Well, be that as it may, idealism does not require Christian faith. For Lewis certainly was not a Christian as he moved towards idealism. Lewis kept the idea of the spirit behind the universe as something other than the Christian God. He didn't want it to be the Christian God. He apparently appeals to Greek philosophy at one point, for he writes in Surprised by Joy, quote, I was compelled to give up realism. I had been trying to defend it because realism satisfied an emotional need that he had. Okay? He wanted to distance himself from the existence of God. I wanted nature to be quite independent of our observation, something other, indifferent, self-existing. But now it seemed to me I had to give that up. Unless I were to accept an unbelievable alternative, I must admit that mine was no late-come phenomenon, that the whole universe was, in the last resort, mental, that our logic was participation in a cosmic logos. And here, when he is thinking of logos, this is a Greek philosophical reference. He is by no means trying to move towards John chapter 1. Barfield, of course, did consider the Christian logos of John 1 as the spirit behind everything. And one wonders how Lewis could come this far to believe in something personal behind everything and not at least become a theist right away. When he later wrote Surprised by Joy, he admitted it was rather astonishing, wasn't it? He says, I suspect there was some willful blindness. He also had to confess, and so the great angler, capital A. That's a fisherman for those of you. And so the great angler played his fish, and I never dreamed that the hook was in my tongue. Amusingly, at this time, Lewis wrote to Barfield a brief note in February of 1930, about his difficulty in holding off from a full theism. It's hilarious. He says, terrible things are happening to me. The spirit, or the real I, is showing an alarming tendency to become much more personal and is taking the offensive and behaving just like God. You'd better come on Monday at the latest, or I may have entered the monastery. Oh, he's so funny. Well, in Surprised by Joy, Lewis tells about 4 things in particular that did lead him to become that reluctant convert to theism, that, as he calls himself. And he likens these 4 moves to a chess game. He says, quote, all over the board, my pieces were in the most disadvantageous positions. Soon I could no longer cherish even the illusion that the initiative lay with me. My adversary began to make his final moves. The first move was his rereading of the Hippolytus by Euripides. You may recall Screwtape's complaint against Wormwood for letting his patient read a good book just because he enjoyed it, and how that had broken his demonic spell over him. Well, here it happens to Lewis, but it was his own spell of realism that was broken. He so much enjoyed the imaginative pleasure of the play that all of his inhibitions about the place of the imaginative in his life were thrown away. Now, this is where his realism is starting to break down, okay? This is before he makes this full move to idealism. So this meant that the imaginative reassumed its priority in his life. Earlier in his life, very imaginative, loved to read all this imaginative stuff. This is not the first time he's read Euripides, okay? But he's rereading it, and all the old feelings are coming back. The second move occurred in 1924, and it was another book that he read, and he says it consolidated the first move. And the book was Stephen Alexander's book, Space, Time, and Deity. Now, this Alexander had a theory about how we think about or experience or consider something. So it's a psychological thing. He says 2 things happen at once. We enjoy it and we contemplate it. The 2 activities have their own distinction, but in a sense they're the same. They are us thinking, but it's like two sides of a coin. There's enjoyment and consideration or reflection. Now, what happens if you observe something and thus enjoy and contemplate it? But then, what happens if you shift your attention from the thing you are observing to your observing it? What happens? Your thinking shifts from the object to an act of introspection. You're looking at yourself now. Well, you are no longer enjoying or contemplating the object, are you? You have changed subjects. Instead of thinking about the object, you're thinking about your thinking about it. Now, Lewis says that this observation of Alexander's, quote, I accepted this distinction at once and have ever since regarded it as an indispensable tool of thought, unquote. And that's true. You'll see it popping up. It affected his idealism and thus was a hindrance to Lewis's following Barfield as far as Barfield wanted him to go. In other words, this distinction, it didn't keep him from going to idealism, but it did keep him from going all the way into this sort of pantheistic, the Spirit is thinking through me, imagining through me kind of stuff that Barfield was in. Just real quick, if my imagining is the Spirit imagining through me, then when I stop looking at the thing and look at the imagining, the introspective mood, and my looking at the imagining is the Spirit thinking through me, then the Spirit is looking at the Spirit, which can't happen because the Spirit just is. So it's a logical contradiction in the idea of the identification of this Spirit, okay? It's kind of a complicated thing. I don't have any more time for this. I'm going to move on. Okay, so we follow the narrative of his becoming a theist, and this theory of thought affected his understanding of his imaginative and emotional experience of joy. How is that? Well, he says that within moments of having read Alexander, because this pursuit of joy is really a big thing in his life, okay? So it easily pops up, into his thinking. Within moments of reading Alexander, he began to see logical consequences of what he would call the two sides of the coin of thought. He recognized that the enjoyment and the contemplation of our inner activities, that as when we exercise introspection, that these two things are incompatible with one another. He says, for example, quote, "You cannot hope and also think about hoping at the same moment. For in hope, we look to hope's object, and we interrupt this, so to speak, turning around to look at the hope itself." And he said that this understanding was like a flash of new light on his whole life. Why? Because all his life he'd been having these experiences of joy, and he kept wanting to identify that experience. What is this thing? Now, based on this new understanding, he realized that once he shifted from the enjoyment of the experience to trying to contemplate the experience so he could identify it, there was nothing left to contemplate. Because he was only interacting with the joy when he was enjoying it. Once he tries to contemplate it, he's not doing that anymore, and so he can't look at it because it's not there to look at. It was just something enjoyed. This had been a puzzle, and now he saw clearly what was happening. The experience of joy never was an object to be contemplated, to be examined. It was never an end in itself. It was a means to an end. This transcendent experience. The experience was pointing to something else for him to contemplate. It did want him to contemplate, but to contemplate something else. After all, the experience was a kind of desire or longing for something, but as Lewis says, quote, "A desire is turned not to itself, but to its object. And not only that, but it owes all of its character to its object. The form of the desired is in the desire." Plato. This means that if he liked the desire, the joy, then what he needed to do was not to try to figure out what that desire was so he could find a way of repeating it, but to seek the thing that was desired, the thing outside of the desire that prompted the desire. He says, quote, "Joy itself, considered simply as an event in my own mind, or contemplated as such, turned out to be of no value at all. All the value lay in that of which joy was the desiring. And that object, quite clearly, was no state of my own mind or body at all. The joy was not desiring something in his mind or pointing to his mind. The experience was actually trying to point him to a third subject. It was as if the experience was saying to him, quote, "It is not I. I am only a reminder. Look, what do I remind you of?" Unquote. And Lewis admits that having come to this realization, he did not yet ask who is being desired, but only what is being desired. You see, he's resisting. He doesn't want to call it a who. But he does say, "This brought me into the region of awe. For I thus understood that in deepest solitude," when he's on his own listening to some music or looking at something beautiful, "there is a road right out of the self," because this thing is trying to point me somewhere else. "There is a commerce with something which, by refusing to identify itself with any object of the senses, or anything imagined, or any state of our own minds, proclaims itself sheerly objective. Far more objective than bodies, for it is not like them, clothed in our senses. The naked other, capital O, imageless, unknown, undefined, desired," unquote. So you can see how this nudges him to theism, Because after all he had to do was to substitute the word person for the other, and you would have had God. And since this whole joy thing was a lifelong pursuit and of great importance to him, this revelation was of supreme importance. But it was only the second move in the game. But Lewis says it was like losing your last bishop. The third move was a refinement of his idealism based on his new insight that he now had about joy. We as souls have our root in the absolute being from which we have our being. It is only right that we should yearn for unity with the being who is our source. And that being the case, then experiences of joy fit human experience very nicely. It's the kind of thing you would expect. I mean, if this is our origin, then you would think that we would desire some sort of participation in the basis of our own being. We would want to get home, as it were. And this dovetailing of his idealism philosophy with his lifelong pursuit of joy meant that his philosophy was now getting much more serious. He says he did not realize what this was going to lead to, but it was like losing a pawn early in the game, not realizing that it would be mate in just a few moves. Then finally, there was the fourth move, okay? As he was teaching philosophy, he realized that one of the philosophers he respected was an idealist, but he was also a theistic idealist. This guy had the guts to make the move. He admitted some absolute behind all existence, as Lewis did, but he did not hesitate to go ahead and call him God. Lewis realized he was going to have to do the same, but if he did, he would just have plenty of footnotes. He may be God, but we'll call him the God of popular religion. Certainly not a God with whom we could have a personal relationship. No more than a character in a play could have a personal relationship with the author. But then he read G.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man, and from that point on, it was checkmate. Lewis says, "Then I read Chesterton's Everlasting Man, and for the first time saw the whole Christian outline of history set out in a form that seemed to me to make sense." Subsequently, he wrote, quote, "Really, a young atheist cannot guard his faith too carefully. Dangers lie in wait for him on every side." Well, he finally caved into theism, and it was not long before he had his late-night talk with Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien, fellow Inklings, which led him to the realization that the story of Christianity was a myth that happened to also be historic. And the author of the play wrote himself into the play, and now Lewis, a character in God's play, could have a personal relationship with him, and this convinced Lewis to become a Christian. So then, we've got him saved. But this conversion to Christianity would have a profound effect upon his philosophy and those discussions that he'd been having with Barfield. If you look at some of those discussions he had with Barfield, he's really buying into all of this. I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, but anyway, he's buying into Barfield a lot. But then later you start seeing some distancing, and that's what we're looking at now. The main influence of his conversion for Lewis was that he now leaned away from the implied pantheistic ideas in Barfield's idealism, and he gave more credit to the biblical story. Okay? Lewis reads his Bible, he knows his Bible, and he tries to root everything in the Bible. Okay? Even though he's also very philosophic, he really pays attention to Scripture. He did maintain his idea that the root of all reality is in the Logos, who he now identified as the creator in the Bible. But instead of our souls being here as an extension of the Spirit, or an extension of God, as it were, we are true created individuals. Okay, there's a difference there. So that earlier, he would be saying that the real I is the Spirit thinking and living through me. Now he wouldn't say that. He would say, I exist because of the Creator, but I have an I am myself, that he has made. Lewis says, in pantheism, God is all. But the whole point of creation surely is that he was not content to be all. He intends to be all in all. There's something else that he's going to be in. So God created something other than himself so that he might be all in all of that. Now, as for that facet of our minds we call the imagination, this was no longer, in Lewis's thinking, our spiritual awareness of the absolute, the medium through which the Spirit is imagining through us, and thus is our experience of the absolute. Rather, imagination became a lesser faculty of our souls. It was farther down the ladder. Imagination is not an emanation of the presence of God, but it is a created faculty that reflects things that are true about God, or at least has the capacity to do so. It is not a source of new, unique truth that is unassociated or unresultant from observation or reason. This kind of goes along with that one question that was asked last night about the overlap of imagination and reason. And there's this idea that the imagination is an independent source of objective truth from reason. Lewis says, no, it can help us to find objective truth, but it's not a source of that kind of knowledge. What knowledge we gain from the imagination is not some new outbreak of truth directly from God. Rather, it is an inner reflection of what we have learned elsewhere. He writes in Surprised by Joy, quote, I think that all things in their way reflect heavenly truths, the imagination not least. But reflect is the important word. He makes this emphasis in order to distinguish reflection of truth from Barfield's idea of presence of truth, direct conduct of truth, conduit of truth. This lower life of the imagination is not a beginning nor a step toward the life of the Spirit, merely an image. Now, in this paragraph of Surprised by Joy, he finishes by saying that even though his imagination had no element either of belief or of ethics, in other words, no truth value content, it still had, at however many removes, it still had the shape of the reality that it reflected. Now, this is interesting. Lewis doesn't say, well, where does this shape come from? Is it possibly a result of our being created in the image of God? I don't know where he thinks it comes from, but he does use the figure of hierarchy here to speak of the distance of the shape of reality reflected by our imagination. He says imagination has the shape of a reality which is removed from us from the original by a number of stages. You think of Jacob's ladder, okay? Now, I have cut out a whole part here about hierarchical thinking, but Lewis has this image, and we'll come back to it again later this morning, of how reality and our interaction with God is via this hierarchy of things. He bases it, at one point he bases it on that verse where Paul says that the head of every man, head of every woman is Christ, and the head of Christ is God, where he reflects a universal hierarchy going on in creation and also even in the Godhead itself. So we live in a hierarchical universe. Now, egalitarians don't want to admit that. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. Okay, it's even in the Trinity itself. So we're in a hierarchical universe, and so somehow our communion and also ontologically our own being and faculties are engaging with the universe in a hierarchical fashion. Okay, now let's tie up some things here. Though Lewis recognizes that Christ is at the back of all being and our lives are hid in him, with his conversion to Christianity, he leaves behind the metaphysical importance that Barfield's idealism lended to the human imagination. Instead, he balances the immanence of Christ in our being with a real individualization, which God has granted to each of us, his creatures. Thus, the more I share in the divine nature, I'm not losing my individuality, standing around going, Om, or whatever, but rather I'm becoming more of the individual he intends me to be. reflecting the image of Christ in a unique way. And we compare that to our observations in the Great Divorce last night. Okay, it's 10 o'clock. Now I'm going to change gears a little bit. But I only have 15 minutes. So we'll see how this goes. Because at this point, I want to bring to your attention something you probably never heard of. Everybody I talked to has never heard this, except for one professor that I talked to. She happened to have heard this before. I want to introduce some ideas from the theological movement of today called Radical Orthodoxy. The reason is that these people share aspects of what Barfield was trying to do, and they advocate Barfield's ideas. Though Lewis moved away from Barfield's pantheistic anthroposophy, my concern is just how far he moved from that, and how would he therefore relate to Radical Orthodoxy today, since they like Barfield so much. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because Reformed Orthodoxy is likely to continue to have an ever greater influence. And if we already grant to C.S. Lewis authority, then it would be nice to know what he says about these kinds of things to help us evaluate Radical Orthodoxy as well as Barfield. So in a nutshell, Radical Orthodoxy, commonly abbreviated RO, they're a bunch of Anglicans, so they abbreviate, RO. We're in the C of E. Radical Orthodoxy is an attempt to move the Western world out of the cultural death in which we find ourselves into a new future that builds on the view of God, creation, and the church handed down to us from the church fathers and medieval Christendom, along with the Neoplatonism that characterizes it. This is not an attempt to turn the clock back to the good old days, as we say, but it is an acknowledgement of what we may still affirm about the modern, while restoring theology as the main consideration in all fields of learning and endeavor. All considerations. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. Traffic laws. Viruses. Do we use gain of function or not? All considerations must begin by giving God his superior place instead of usurping his rightful place with human reason. James K.A. Smith, in his book, Introduction to Radical Orthodoxy, explains that what we call postmodernity, our current situation, is really the modern in the extreme, or gone to seed. Why does he say that? Because the same old prejudice against all things religious and the exaltation of reason as the sole path of knowledge just keeps on going. It hasn't changed. This prejudice has resulted in the loss of a more holistic understanding of the universe, and it has consequently emptied the life out of nature, the human, and our society. So that this modernity on steroids has now reduced all of human thinking and activity to power struggles and violent tactics. That's all it is. That's all it does in all considerations. We therefore feel adrift and lost in a culture that worships a cynical and sentimental self with a capital S, with the result that we are in a worse condition than that famous summary of life in ancient Israel in the time of the judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Yeah, that sounds like today, but it's actually worse. The psalmist asks us in Psalm 11, verse 3, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? He gives the answer in the next verse. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold, his eyelids try the children of men. God is still present and dealing with human affairs. Our only hope for a restoration of foundations is therefore in him. Now, Radical Orthodoxy is a fluid project to attempt such a restoration. The leaders want to move our society into a future that is really postmodern. Get rid of it. Leaving behind the errors, the disenchantment, and the death of the modern, Radical Orthodoxy seeks to confront the desperate souls of our fellows with the Christian faith as it happily applies in every field and institution. John Milbank, now of University of Nottingham, one of the main proponents of radical orthodoxy, writes this. He says, first of all, this movement denies that there is a sharp division between reason and faith, or reason and revelation, and regards any such notion as a modern deviation from earlier views. It believes that human nature can only be fully understood with reference to our supernatural destiny and human knowledge with reference to divine illumination. It also considers that the world can only be fully understood as participation in divine being, truth, goodness, and unity. Now that's a very nice Barfieldian statement there. This movement is comprised of theologians and philosophers around the world with fundamental ties to historic Anglo-Catholicism. It is still very much a company of scholars, some of whom are very difficult to follow, so that it is no wonder that people seem to have not heard of it. It can be a bit inaccessible. Hopefully, as their views progress and solidify, there will be popularizers that can help us to understand it better. But it is easy enough to recognize a commonality in key components with the writing of Barfield to make a comparison. Now, there was something I was going to say, having an old person moment. All right, I think now by participation, you understand, like how when you participate in sports, you can be at all kinds of different ways of participating in sport. So if we talk about participating in the divine nature, then there's all kinds of different ways that we are sharing, communing with. Some theologians will use the word koinonia, fellowship with God. Others say, no, that's a little bit something different, not so ontological, but there it is at any rate, okay? So that's when we're talking about this participation, as Milbank has just said, that you cannot understand human nature or the world without understanding participation, divine being. I'm going to leave that with you. It is Platonic. We could get more into it later, but at any rate, there it is. So, and as far as Barfield is concerned, one point that I wanted to make is that Barfield sees human culture heading towards somewhere. And he sees that eventually our circumstances, our contexts, our cultures are going to get so miserable that we are going to begin to ask better questions and seek better answers than what we're getting. And we will therefore go back to looking to divine resources, to revelation and illumination and so forth. And that's something that Radical Orthodoxy thinks as well. They see themselves as being able to lead human culture not back to where it had been in Christendom, but onto a new Christendom. Okay, but it's still Christendom. Christ is the beginning and the end of everything. Now you may be thinking, how in the world is some corporate board going to accept that? What's interesting is that they are making inroads, at least in academia, where they are being respected. And part of that has to do with the way everything's been so deconstructed that if you want to bring up religion, why not? And so they do, and people listen. It's kind of like, well, that is kind of interesting, you see? And so you can start making inroads in that fashion. All right, so how does Lewis fit into all this? We started out with a biographical look at his ideas of nature and of human imagination. We recognized the influence of Barfield and his other friends that eventually led him to Christianity. We began to consider how Lewis moved away from some of the ideas he'd shared with Barfield. Some of Barfield's thinking is present today in Radical Orthodoxy. But how much would Lewis dovetail with R.O.? I would say that he does to a certain extent. And we're going to jump into just a little bit of that here as we end. We're going to look at something he wrote at the end of his life, Letters to Malcolm, which is a fictional book in the sense that it is an imagined series of letters to an imaginary person named Malcolm. Sorry to disappoint you, there's no real Malcolm. And no real Betty, his wife, and George, his son. Lewis used this form of writing because he wanted to speculate about a number of issues. And if he did this speculation in letters instead of a book on theology or philosophy, The informality of it enabled him to express himself without coming across like he was an authority, because he really did not want to act like he knew what he was talking about when it comes to Christian prayer. He did not feel himself an expert or someone that should be, pontificating on that subject. Now, the 13th letter is something of an exposition of Romans 8:26, where we read this. Now get this picture. Likewise, the Spirit also helps our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought. But the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. Lewis is trying to understand what is going on here when the Christian prays. Who's doing the praying? Is it God or is it me? It says the Spirit is making intercession for us. My praying is really too weak to do the job. So the Spirit's, that kind of sounds like the Spirit doing something through us, like Barfield would say, doesn't it? Sort of this pantheistic sort of thing. Who's doing, or is it both? Is it God and me? Well, Lewis wants to advocate the interpretation that both parties are active. He starts off by referring to Owen Barfield's book, Saving the Appearances. For there, Barfield says that we've got to regard God as other than ourselves, or we have no religion. I mean, what is religion except worshiping somebody else? He's got to be somebody else. On the other hand, we cannot think of our existence as somehow parallel to his own, okay? Like, I've got my thing going and God's got his thing going. No. Our existence is not independent like his existence is. He's the ground of our being. We are dependent on him for existing. That's a different kind of parallel. Quote, he's always both within us and over against us. Our reality is so much from his reality as he, moment by moment, projects into us. The deeper the level within ourselves from which our prayer or any other act wells up, the more it is his, but not at all the less ours. Rather, most ours when his. There's that idea of the closer I am to God, the more I am myself. Lewis makes a distinction between two kinds of unity we experience with God. This kind of helps understand it. There is the unity of being as we as creatures participate in the being of God. We've been talking a lot about that. But there is also a conscious union of wills. This is where spiritual formation comes in. There is also a conscious union of wills as we, participating in God's grace, pursue his will as individual saints. See that? There's a difference between talking about my existence, where do I come from? How do I continue? And then a unity that I have with him in that I'm on his team, so to speak. He says, the ontological continuity is, I take it, unchangeable, and it exists between God and a reprobate or a devil, no less than between God and a saint. Every creature is dependent upon God for their existence. And then Lewis quotes Psalm 139. Whither shall I go then from thy presence? If I go down to hell, thou art there also. But as for the union of our wills, it is a result of some effort of our own, however feeble. He says, quote, what God labors to do or say through the man comes back to God with a distortion which at any rate is not total. And this statement seems to be an echo of Philippians 2:12 and 13. Very important passage of Scripture for spiritual formation. Paul says, wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God which worketh in you, both to will and to do, and by that will, both to desire and to do of his good pleasure. His will doesn't replace your will. You've still got to use your will. So don't misunderstand that. It's desire and the ability he works in us. And you can readily see the parallel problem here. God is working in me like he is when I'm praying, but am I supposed to pray or am I supposed to work? Who's doing what? Well, the verse substantiates Lewis's claim. It's both. Paul does not explain how it works. He just says this is what it is. This is what's going on. And what we need to do is to not try to figure out how it works. Just be sure we're doing our part. Okay? Praying, of course, in utter helplessness for the grace to do it. Okay? Because what happens is you spend time trying to figure out things that you can't really figure out. And you're wasting your time when you're doing that. You may even be sliding backwards a little bit. So, just recognize that. And we learn how to walk in that, in those poles. God's truth is always in poles, okay? Sovereignty, free will, just whatever you want. It's always in poles. Somehow we walk in the midst of it. They're not contradictory. We're just limited in our understanding, okay? And God's trying to be truthful with us. Sorry, but you just can't understand this, But this is the way it is. So learn to walk with it. I'm with you. I'll help you. Okay. And it is here in this passage in letter 13 that the statement I referred to before comes in. In pantheism, God is all, but the whole point of creation surely is that he was not content to be all. He intends to be all in all. And that last phrase, all in all, is a quotation from 1 Corinthians 15:28, where Paul says, "And when all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him, that put all things under him, that God may be all in all." Well, because of the time, I did want to spend a little bit of time in letter 14. And the important thing about letter 14 is that, let's see here. Lewis goes to that passage, that long passage where Jesus is talking about the judgment, and he talks about how people are judged according to whether they came to him in prison or if they were with him when he was sick and that sort of thing, because if you did it to my brethren, you did it to me, that passage. And so but there's like, wait a minute, and you can see how who's doing what here, or who is who, because Jesus is saying, I was that person. Well, no, wait a minute. Are you that person, or are they that person? Who am I giving this cup of water to? And so it's part of this whole thing of trying to figure out this business of how we relate to God when we are both ontologically very dependent, but he also has created us, according to the Bible, as separate individuals. So what do we learn from letters to Malcolm? And we'll have to close it up. I'll refer you to something else, or you can look at the notes on your phone or your iPad later. First of all, Lewis maintains the idea of God's being the root of all being and his act as the source of all acts. This would require God to be the initial consideration when discussing all activities as human beings, thus recognizing the importance of theology for all domains of human endeavor. Now that's radical orthodoxy right there. Lewis is right there with them. Secondly, he definitely recognizes the principle of participation all the way through, even in the least creatures. And this would apply not only to our praying, but to all of our works, referring to Philippians chapter 2. And so this, again, is something that radical orthodoxy would advocate. Thirdly, Lewis still appreciates insights from Barfield. He, like in Letters to Malcolm, he says, I go along with what Barfield says about this. And that's very radical orthodoxian. And he is doing this even here at the end of his life as a Christian. So this really is what Lewis believed. And so all three of these things are things that we find that would dovetail Lewis with radical orthodoxy. The last thing I was going to refer to is in the discarded image. And again, you can read it. I'll leave these notes up for about a week or so on the blog. And it is the point that, let's see, what was it? That things are going to have to somehow come to a head, and there will have to be a change. All right, I need to quit. Let me just say, in this largely barbaric West, which is either turned from the Christian faith or is simply ignorant of it. I mean, these days, it's, you just have people, they just don't even know what's going on. There is still hunger for meaning, okay? there is still hunger for meaning. Where does meaning come from? From the use of the imagination. Imagination is the organ of meaning. God teaches us to recognize the place of the imagination in our faith. Hebrews 11, for example. We therefore should encourage others to be imaginative and see the unseen realities that lie behind our daily experience, whether we're thinking ontologically or the grace of God that's present with me. We pray for the illuminating work of the Holy Spirit to enable them to acknowledge the reality that is there, and so encourage them to consider, as Lewis eventually did, the question, who is at the bottom of all this? Okay?
All right, questions? And I'll just bring the mic to you. Just raise your hand. We'll come around.
Okay, so I'm actually going to show a whole lot of my ignorance in the question I'm
Hey,
about to
that's
ask.
quite all right.
So I've actually attempted to read a little bit about Radical Orthodoxy, and very quickly realized that I was out of my depth. You mentioned about how it's so dense that a lot of people aren't into it. I was more, and I was surprised because when I saw in the pamphlet you put Radical Orthodoxy, and I was like, wait, are we going there? And I guess just clarify the history of it, because I gave up pretty quickly trying to get into it. But I was under the impression that it was more like a kind of a 90s, like that's when it was really popular. But is there still, and I know like David Milbank gets into arguments on Twitter, and David Bentley Hart, I think, was a part of it as well, and he's out doing his thing. But like, are there people who are still interested in Radical Orthodoxy, like beyond like that Twitter checkmark crew?
Yeah. First of all, let me say that I'm new to this as well. It's only been, I don't know, maybe just 2 or 3 months that I first learned about Radical Orthodoxy. And it was through, and I was researching stuff, I was researching for these topics, and anything about Lewis and imagination. And I came across a lecture given about, let's see, when was it? Maybe about 4 years ago in Virginia at a Mars Hill conference, if you're familiar with Mars Hill Audio. It was given by John Milbank's wife, Allison. And her expertise is using imagination for Christian apologetic versus rational kind of arguments. And she mentioned how Lewis wasn't really all the way in there with them like she would wish he would be, though his fiction, she said, was just spot on. And so, and there are books that continue to come out. I think it was like a week before, no, I think it may have been the week that the COVID lockdowns hit at Regent College in Vancouver. Dr. Milbank was supposed to speak to them about Radical Orthodoxy. One of their professors, you can see this on YouTube, one of their professors gave an introduction to Radical Orthodoxy and trying to sort of prep people for the fire hose they were about to get washed with by John Milbank. And so it's still current. Yeah, it still is. And it needs to be, because it's got a long row to hoe.
It's definitely like, sorry.
It's okay, no, go ahead.
It seemed like they were trying to create a new language, because like just you hear
Yes.
Christianese and everything.
Yes.
Is to create a new language
Yes.
to speak with.
Right.
But it's also so academically
Yes.
dense.
Yes.
You have Christianese to academic
Yes.
that it's almost impossible for a normal person to really, and I mean, I would consider myself at least moderately intelligent.
Yeah, right.
It's just taking too much time.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And a lot of words have italics in them.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it just seemed like, I was very surprised, but also like, oh, cool, that's something
Yeah.
I wanted to get into, but it seemed like it was kind of a fad, but apparently it still has legs.
Yeah, if you start doing searches on YouTube, you'll run into stuff that's fairly recent. There is one line that this professor at Regent made that was just really great, because he was showing on the screen a quote from John Milbank that Oliver O'Donovan theologian, philosopher, pointed at as just being so obscure. How in the world can you understand this guy? Because he's one of those people that explains things by referring to authors. Just as so-and-so said, it's like so-and-so, but then it's contradicted by this guy over here. It's like, unless you've read all these books, it's hopeless. But the professor at Regent said, what's so funny is Oliver O'Donovan does the same thing. It can be very hard as well. But anyway, so much for that. Any other questions? Yes, sir, over here.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what you were talking about, Lewis's life history in terms of development of his thinking there. And one thing, maybe you're going to get to this the next hour because I'm not sure what your third talk is about. But one book that Lewis said was highly influential in his life was George MacDonald's Phantastes. He said when he read it, and I think he was very young, this was well before he read it, and he said it baptized his imagination.
Yes.
And I was wondering where does that fit into his?
Yes. Where it fits in, he did not mean that it Christianized his imagination. It meant that it transformed it, brought it into another element. And it's very helpful if you read his he did an anthology of George MacDonald sayings, like 4 years, that kind of a thing, and he wrote a preface on it, which gives his background with MacDonald and what he thinks about him and so forth. And it's very enlightening. And it's in there that he says that one of the main things that MacDonald was good at was writing about death. It was a good death. And when you read MacDonald's novels, it's almost funny because it's like several of them that I've read. The idea is, that people keep telling the main character, look, until you die, you really can't get anything done. You need to go ahead and do this, which in fantasy you can work that out, but it is you can see how take up your cross, die to yourself, follow him, and so forth. So okay, she had a question. I think there's another one back here too.
You mentioned the discarded image, and considering Lewis's studies in medieval literature and thought, I just wondered what you thought of, like, how you would connect Lewis's teachings on medieval thought with his Christian imagination.
Yes, ma'am. One thing about Lewis is, when he does become a Christian, he already is one of the best read people in the world of Christendom, literature of Christendom. So he already knows what's going on. He just hadn't wanted to believe it himself. And he also preferred and really enjoyed and loved the way of looking at the world that the medievals had. So what he does is, because he loves it and he likes it, he thinks about why, and he recognizes what is true about it. And so just like with Radical Orthodoxy, is not trying to deny what is good and can be affirmed about the modern world, but wants to go on from there. Lewis, in A Discarded Image, says, don't think I'm trying to put the clock back, but I am trying to help us to understand that every age has a different way of viewing the world and reality. We bring our questions, based upon our assumptions. And it just so happens that in those days, they didn't have the scientific advances we had, but they were asking the right questions, whereas the moderns are asking the wrong questions. And so what he is trying to do in his writings is he's trying to help us to see what is beautiful and theologically correct from a Christian and biblical viewpoint about the old views, so that we would reacquire those, which is the same kind of thing that Radical Orthodoxy is doing. The Imitation of Christ. Who wrote that, doggone it? Kempis. He read The Imitation daily. And he's teaching on medieval people all the time and early Renaissance people. So he's just all the time in that world. And so it just flavors everything. So he has this sort of a literary Christianity. He deals with everything, in that sort of fashion. So I don't know if that helps or not, but it's kind of, was that all right? Do you have any other questions, or am I missing the point?
I just have the belief that that his studies in medieval literature really shaped how he would see the world, or how he would, even though he didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, they were wrong in a lot of ways, but also,
Yes.
I just wondered if you, could help people understand how he thought, through his work, and how that related to his own imagination in his life. Yeah, that's it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you can, by some of the things that he says, for example, there in, this is just going to take a second, Jack. In the discarded image, he says, I hope no one will think that I'm recommending a return to the medieval model. Let's see here, where was it? I forget where he says it, but he says, it's obvious from my writings that I like this stuff, But, what I am trying to do is help us to understand that the mental temper of these people is something that we could learn from. There was another thing that was very important that was always with him and is throughout his writings that he got from Owen Barfield. And that was the fallacy of what Barfield called chronological snobbery, which is the idea that time affects the truth of something, and it can go either way. People have the opinion that nothing that's new is worth my attention. I should just read old books. Others people say, nothing that is old is worth my attention. I should only read new things. And what you're doing is you're deciding that the value of something is based upon when it happened or when it occurred or when it was thought and so forth, which is ridiculous. Because because there's been a lot of wonderful things that have been thought and understood before John Dewey, that are much better than anything that he ever came up with. And so it helped Lewis, because Lewis was doing that. He was trying to be modern, and Barfield's laughing at him. So
We're going to have to bring this session to a close and have our break. I know there may have been a few other questions. We're going to have time for that at the conclusion of the final session, so hold on to those. We'll come back around to that.